Mae Brussell in Carmel, California. It's tape number 428, February the 15th, 1980, and it's side one of the tape. The voice you just heard on the record, the beginning of the tape, was Don McLean singing a song from his album American Pie, and it's the opening verse of American Pie. I've used it on other tapes before. My age of learning, or my period of innocence of American political systems, ended in 1963 when John Kennedy was assassinated. I call that my age of innocence. I was 40 years old at the time and was really very ignorant of the American political system and how it worked. I mention that because there are a lot of people under 40 who believe their life is half over and can't begin to study political assassinations or organized crime or corruption. But there's a lot of time and energy in you if you want to do it and if you get the spark. And I started my work when I was 40 years old, when Kennedy was assassinated. And since that time, in the pursuit of trying to find out who killed one person, President John Kennedy, you open up a whole Pandora of corruption from the Chief Justice, the White House, the President, international leaders, the police chiefs, the district attorneys, the defense lawyers, the prosecutors. The entire judicial system is exposed for what it is when you get into the subject of the Kennedy assassination. It's a microcosm of the way society is run and manipulated, and his murder was just one of among millions of murders and hundreds of heads of states in order to gain control and power over the peons or the peasants. And those are the people that go to work every day and pay their taxes and say yes. And in the process of studying the Kennedy assassination, as I say, it opened up many avenues. I'm going to be working the next few weeks, of course, I don't know how long it'll take, consistently taking apart the threads and pieces of the ABSCAM story as it breaks. There are actually 3 investigations going, and they say they have 60 to 100. So this will be a lifetime job, but in these classifications fall, again, the culprits who not only killed John Kennedy, but who controlled the body of Howard Hughes' empire, and were behind many of the other incidences that I have studied. So ABSCAM is not separate from them. It's simply a part of it. It's part of the Watergate story. It's part of the Jonestown story, the Vatican, and in the most simple way that I can do with 1 hour a week, I'll give you bits and pieces and threads of the story as it breaks. So far, there's the ABSCAM story. There's the Bry Lab. That's bribery and labor. ABSCAM has to do with congressmen in Pennsylvania and New Jersey, particularly, and meeting places in New York, Pennsylvania, New York, Washington, D.C., and New Jersey. Bry Lab has to do with Texas, Oklahoma, Arkansas, and Louisiana. But it started off in Beverly Hills, California, and it spreads through Houston and officials in those states of Louisiana, as I say, Oklahoma, Arkansas, and Texas. And then there's the Pendorf examination of a person, so for Alan Dorfman in Chicago with the Teamsters connections and organized crime. That story is breaking simultaneously with the Las Vegas connections to Senator Howard Cannon, and then that goes on down to Los Angeles, and it makes a full cycle from the casino mob in New Jersey to the Vegas mob, and it's like the map that you see when you watch the news stories of the globe and the way the weather is blowing or the wind is blowing in circles. You're going to have to interweave all of these breaking. I hope they break more slowly because the FBI says they have 60 or 100 of these, and they are linked to the entire United States corrupt levels at a certain point. They cut off at another point, and there's a war between the organizations and the mobsters, and that I want to go into again and also bring up. There are links to very important news stories that are taking place now so that you know how to follow those. So we have the ABSCAM, the Bry Lab, and the Pendorf, those 3 investigations that are swooping in and cleaning out specific people. Now, what happens when you limit who you're going to target? Those people, for immunity, are going to name other people, and it's going to be like a ping-pong game going back and forth. What you intend to do isn't what you always get. It's like Jimmy Carter saying, we'll put our fleet in the Persian Gulf. So the Soviet Union says, well, I think I'll send a boat there, too. The Soviet Union is a large landmass, but that doesn't mean they don't have atomic submarines and ships. They send a ship, Russia will send a ship. And it's this kind of response that we're going to get with these investigations. If certain people who are Watergating think that they'll come home clean, those people arrested or up for indictment will name other people, and it will begin to snowball and involve many, many more people than the original intentions. When I use the word war going on, an internal war between, say, the drug market, the power brokers, and the politicians, I mean just that, and in war you get casualties. I'm going to do at length today to set the groundwork for these investigations, and hopefully next week catch up on a backlog of deaths that are important and related to all these matters. One of the subscribers to these tapes sent me a book by Ladislas Farago called Burn After Reading, and the introduction of the book, the preface, has a very important statement that pertains to all that is going on. Farago says that espionage has played a conspicuous part in every war of history. The Second World War, it became larger, known as the Fourth Estate of War. That's when Reinhard Gehlen and the Tsarists from the Soviet Union, when they escaped the Soviet Union, went to Poland and Germany, and these were the teams of the Russian elite that had conducted pogroms and terror and assassination squads, and they set up this complicated spy system with the Germans and the British and the United States and the Italians, and this fourth war, this Fourth Estate carries on this war. And this book gives an example in Greece where the casualties in World War II were 73,000 Greeks. But it goes on to say that 23,000 died in conventional warfare, and 50,000 were killed in various surreptitious enterprises. So when I say that hundreds of people are being killed, hundreds of heads of state and private citizens and witnesses, going maybe into thousands, or who can estimate the figure, what we're getting simultaneously with the power structure are the comparison, such as in Greece, where 50,000 were killed surreptitiously, and when you get to the battlefield, the obvious 23,000 killed in conventional warfare. So maybe next week I'll get caught up on many of the deaths because they're piling up here, and I don't want you to think that I'm forgetting them, but I do want to get into the ABSCAM story right now. And if I jump around and don't have a main starting point, I do have one, but I'm going to be picking up threads of the past and interrupting myself to bring you important things that are coming to my mind in the ABSCAM trial. And of course, its breaking at this time is very important because I've been leading up on the past tapes for the last 2 or 3 months, or say the last 8 years, but particularly the last few months, into stolen art, Vatican connection, stolen stocks and security, deaths of Vatican witnesses to the Sindona trial that's going on in New York City right now, corruption from the drug narcotic traffic that is tangling with our United States agencies and up into the Vatican, the White House, fighting each other at all these different levels. The largest shift in the crime war in the narcotics market that I've mentioned on past tapes took place in 1957. That's when organized crime had a meeting in Italy to decide on how to cut up the earth and flow the traffic into various cities and countries and decide who would be the mob leaders of these areas. There was a meeting in Italy in that year, and there was a meeting up in the Appalachian in 1957 of organized crime, and that was when the decision was made to take Howard Hughes' body completely, and from 57 on, Hughes, who represents the entire security of the United States through the spy system, satellites, and communication network, was kept in confinement until 1966, where he was taken on a train to Boston. And I've referred to William Taub's book recently. Taub talks about John Rosselli of organized crime and agents of the CIA delivering Hughes' body to Boston, and then the Hughes empire under really our Justice Department, the top echelons of the justice, moved into Las Vegas to take over the organized crime and set up crime wars between the Italian Jewish mafia, so they eventually could swing it to the Irish Catholics in Boston, the police departments, the Los Angeles, San Francisco, the Eastern police departments, the Irish Catholic, New York City, run those police, and there's a conflict of payoffs and turf. And I believe that Robert Mayu from Boston with the FBI and CIA was then hired by the Hughes organization in Vegas. He worked with Mo Dalitz there. But there's this crime war going on at different levels simultaneously, and 57 was one of the big meetings. Now, just this last week, there was an article in the newspaper, Associated Press story, that the FBI, because of the ABSCAM story, has broken up the next important meeting of the organized crime that was to take place just this last week. This article, I'm quoting from the San Jose Mercury here, said that the knowledgeable sources said that the FBI had evidence that organized crime bosses were planning as recent as last week, to hold a summit meeting similar in importance to the notorious gathering of 60 crime syndicate bosses at Appalachian, New York in 1957. The purpose of the summit was to carve new geographical boundaries for the illicit operations of various mob leaders such as narcotics traffic and extortion. The sources declined to say where the summit was to take place, but it goes on to say that the inquiry into BriLab, bribery and labor, also may reach every state, state politician and so forth as it spreads. That's what this article says. Well, that's 50 states to keep track of the politicians and see who's singled out. But I have mentioned on previous tapes the importance of the Appalachian meeting. A new meeting was to be planned this last week and was called off by the breaking of these stories at this time. And the carving up of the narcotics, I've gone into the conflicts of the Middle East traffic through Afghanistan that's been cut off by the Soviet Union. That may be one of the reasons they were going to meet. The Marseille traffic that was coming through and was cut off when the Shah of Iran was removed. This tape isn't about drug traffic. This is about the investigations going on. But these investigations involve Atlantic City and Las Vegas, and the important meeting of deciding the turf has been called off with the story breaking at this time, and that may be why the leak took place, so that they wouldn't all meet and be swept up and arrested and caught. They were observed but not arrested, meeting in the Appalachian in 1957. And when I talk about organized crime, I'm talking about a multi-billion-dollar industry that makes it important that you have police dogs, that you put bars on your windows, that people getting mugged on the streets, cars broken in, private property seized, extortion of politicians, bribing them, blackmailing, murders. Prisons are a crime business. The guards, the building of prisons, the contracts. It costs $10,000 to $20,000 or $30,000 each year for every single prisoner. This is a big business. They could all be attending Harvard University at that price, getting an education and a trade. Organized crime affects the salaries of local police, police department, prison chiefs, judges, courts. It runs this country. It is the biggest thing going. And that's why it's so important to follow the threads, because it affects every one of our lives. The minute you step off the curb, you could become a victim of organized crime. And that's why it's important to follow it. And if you wondered why your employees or your children or your siblings or your relatives can't think or spell or concentrate, most of them are victims of some kind of crime, of drugs, the crime of infiltrating their minds, polluting them with many chemicals and drugs that make them totally defenseless against the real problems that are going on in this world. It's even hard to get an army together. Great Britain understood that when they poured the narcotics and opium into China to conquer a large landmass. You dope them, and the United States now is literally conquered because a good percentage of the people are hooked. If it isn't cocaine or marijuana or opium or heroin, it's caffeine, nicotine, and the byproducts of the crime syndicate, the scotch and the liquor, alcohol, the poisons, and so forth that are in their system. There's another article, January 20th, in the New York Times on Trenton, New Jersey, and Atlantic City. The gambling casinos are changing Atlantic City so fast that they're overwhelmed by their success, and it goes into the huge profits and the skyrocketing land values and the tax increases that are going to dislocate area businesses and retail businesses, that the casinos are creating a situation of plenty of jobs and hotel jobs, but the other people are being moved out, and there's land and water and sewage systems that may not be available. That this is a tremendous growing of an industry, the Atlantic City organized crime. And of course, that's the area that this new ABSCAM gets into, and I'm sure it has to do a lot with the land values and moving certain politicians out in order to get a profit from certain pieces of land that are close to the casinos. That's part of the scandal of the Pendorf examination, the probe of Alan Dorfman, representing the Teamsters Union that has very valuable land in Las Vegas, and Senator Howard Cannon has property on the land that were next to the Teamsters property, and he was in contact with members of the Teamsters, and Alan Dorfman represents them, who's been indicted for criminal fraud and various charges. Senator Cannon was interested in land investment, housing investment, which again is linked to organized crime. So it rubs off to members of the Senate who live right next door to it, or people who have money and want to see that go up in value instead of depreciate it, and are pushing land schemes at the same time they're working with organized crime. The San Francisco Examiner, February the 9th, has an article about ABSCAM. It's called FBI's Latest Ties, the Mob to Politicians, and it goes on to refer to 50 such sting operations nationwide, focusing the links between organized crime and politicians. This particular article talks about a payment of $10,000 to Lieutenant Governor Fitzmaurice from Louisiana. We'll go into the Louisiana scandals later on, but the article refers to a $10,000 payment allegedly given to William Clayton of Texas, Speaker of the House. Now, Texas and Louisiana played a big part in the Kennedy assassination, of course, and the Robert Kennedy, Martin Luther King assassinations. But then the article goes on to say one source familiar with the inquiry said that Carlos Marcello, long considered Louisiana's mob chief, and who the House Assassination Committee said may have had some role in the killing of President John Kennedy, demonstrated that he had the muscle to instruct groups to buy insurance despite higher prices. Now, Carlos Marcello's name has been brought in to these investigations, and only one newspaper that I have so far has linked him in that article to the assassination of John Kennedy. I will be jumping around from the ABSCAM to the Bry Lab to the Pendorf. So for those of you who listen to these tapes on radio stations, you can write to me and get a, I'll give you the instructions later, get a printed sheet that accompanies these tapes so you can keep a record of these names as the news unfolds. This article, the Examiner, referred to Carlos Marcello, involved in the Bry Lab scandal, as being long considered Louisiana's mob chief, and who the House Assassinations Committee on Assassinations investigating the murder of John Kennedy and Martin Luther King concluded that he may have had some role in the killing of President John Kennedy. Now, just one article about Marcello mentions the fact that he was considered as having played a part in killing the President of the United States. U.S. District Judge Harry Pragerson, a man with a fairly good reputation, although even Earl Warren had one, and we don't know much about them. Harry Pragerson has been removed from a case involving organized crime that was supposed to begin just at this time. It's been put off till March because the top mobsters are involved in that, and Carlos Marcello was working on this case, and an FBI informant informed Pragerson that Marcello was going to make compromises and give him a $100,000 art object in order to be easy on the prosecution of these organized crime people. There's 5 men accused of racketeering, extortion, pornography, and of killing mobster Frank the Bump Bompanciero in 1977. They're supposed to go before Judge Pragerson, and Jimmy the Weasel Fratriano is the one who is helping with the prosecution. Well, Marcello's name came out again because he wanted to pay and give art objects to Judge Pragerson. So before the case began, or before the objects could be given to see if even Pragerson accepted them, the FBI warned Pragerson, you're going to be contacted by Marcello. They didn't let him. This is what I call selective justice, and this is very important. The FBI is looking into certain people who are criminals on the take working with organized crime and assassination teams. And the FBI, through their informers, had information that Carlos Marcellos and his gang were going to give gifts to Judge Harry Pregerson in return for a light sentence of Jimmy the Weasel Fratriano. So instead of letting the transaction go through, which they did with Senator Williams and other congressmen in New York City, not that they were innocent, they were guilty as hell and probably criminals all of their life, I'm sure. And don't say I'm judging before they're tried. There's so much on these people, I'm sure it would take miles or years of testimony to uncover all of their wheelings and dealings. But the point is that they let certain people get caught in a web without warning them in advance, instead of going to congressmen and saying this is a net. If the FBI has a net, then it should follow through if it has what they call a sting. So if they had information that Carlos Marcellos had people who were going to give favors to Judge Pregerson for Fratriano's accusation of these 5 mobsters from San Diego, then they should have waited to see if Pregerson kicked them out, like Congressman Pressler did. Senator Pressler said, I don't want any of your merchandise, it's illegal. They should have let Pregerson refuse the offer on his own, and then said, this is an honest judge, and these people were tampering with the case. But instead, they went to Pregerson and said, you're going to be targeted, so you get off the case and get a different judge. How do we know the judge that is being replaced on the trial isn't already in the pay of these people, and Pregerson is moved out because he might have refused the offer? This is a point which I want to make clear, because I make the accusation over and over that selected people are protected and selected people are targeted. And this is a perfect example of the FBI warning a man before he's entrapped. If he's corrupt, he should be removed from office. Pregerson shouldn't be allowed to be a judge in Los Angeles on these cases if he accepts those gifts and gives a light sentence to the defendants. But why is he sliding out of the case, not touching it at all? A new judge is coming in. How do we know that the new judge, as I say, isn't in control? It's that kind of selection. When I talk about ABSCAM and the entrapment of these people, I don't say they're innocent, but I say they have selectively, in this crime war of the FBI and the Justice Department, chosen who they'll protect and who they will prosecute or go after. And it's that selection that I get mad when I see the whole fabric of corruption, and I realize that the arrest and the slapping on the hand is very selective, and most of the time the top bosses go home free. I referred last week to ABSCAM as Carter scam or Vatican. The Vatican could be involved or drawn in. Jimmy Carter's drug connections in Georgia could be drawn in. But you see Paul Lazalt from Nevada, who ran the whole Hughes operation and worked for the Summa Corporation, for the Howard Hughes CIA, FBI, Intertel operation, runs Ronald Reagan's campaign, and yet Reagan is never linked or associated with the narcotics gang, the mobsters, organized crime. He goes home free as a candidate. John Connally is never exposed with his links to Montego Bay, the assassination teams, the Nazis, the organized crime people that were in on the killing of Kennedy, and how they worked in Texas when he was the governor or when he was Secretary of the Treasury, the lack of prosecution of crime figures getting off from being deported or put in jail. In other words, Howard Baker is protected of covering up Watergate. He was on Meet the Press talking about a Senate investigation of ABSCAM. There's issues and answers at Meet the Press that we should have an investigation like Watergate. I'll do another tape. It's been years since I did a radio show on the collusion of Howard Baker with the CIA, reporting back to Richard Nixon and covering up the Watergate scandal. So you can bring in the Mormon Mafia, Paul Lazalt, the Hughes, Intertel, the Interpol, the International Network, can bring down certain areas of drug war faction, which could include the Georgia, Carter, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, also Miami. I forgot to mention ABSCAM involves Miami and South Carolina. You can bring them down and still leave Connally, Reagan, and Baker as Mr. Clean, because the Justice Department is doing their selective pushing out, and this is the response of Watergate. This is the baby of Watergate, the response of cleaning out very liberal Democratic members of Congress and throw in a few maybe that aren't so liberal, but some of them, most of them are doing a pretty good job, and smearing them to crime selectively. Of course, they didn't have to take the bait. They did, but many have been on bigger payoffs. The Iranian payoffs from Zahidi and the Washington payoffs of the Watergate payoffs, Koreagate, Iranian Gate. All of this is being hushed under while we're getting a different level of petty ante at getting certain people who are in control in Atlantic City and pushing them out of power just as they were in control in Las Vegas until 1966. This will push the certain people in control out of the gaming multi-billion-dollar industry in Atlantic City and bring in a new team to coordinate with the people that took over Vegas in 1966. The groundwork here, I think I have to go at length into because the very elements that were in Vegas in 66 that came in and cleaned it out when Howard Hughes left in 1970, Intertel have taken over with Resorts International, have really taken over the Atlantic City area now. And while all the other casinos are on a conditional lease and they have to reapply and reappear, Resorts International just got a few months ago a permanent license for the gaming tables there, just as they run since 1970 the tables in Nevada, so that New Jersey and Nevada can be run by Intertel, which is an organization of people, formerly the Justice Department, the FBI, and the CIA, who are now pushing out the old dogs in order to run this huge business that involves billions and billions of dollars. The Justice Department, the FBI aren't here to find justice. They're here to make it safe for certain factions of the narcotic market that work with the White House on down. And this selection is very important, the way they choose who they're to target and protect. And as I say, going to Judge Harry Pragerson before he's approached with the money isn't fair cricket, because they should have waited to see if he took it, and if he took it, remove him. And now we have to investigate who replaces him and see what their links are to what I call the new team. Now, when I talk about ABSCAM or Brylab or Pendoff, let me show how they connect in just a person like Carlos Marcello, who is from organized crime from New Orleans, who can affect the judge in Los Angeles, who works all over the United States, and who has been named by the House Select Committee for a possible role in the killing of John Kennedy. David Ferry worked with Carlos Marcello. David Ferry worked with the CIA, with the Greek Orthodox Church, and had a role with Clay Shaw and all of them in the assassination of John Kennedy, and with Lee Harvey Oswald in the New Orleans area. Not only was Marcello named in the Brylab, which had to do with organized crime in the Southwest and the officials in Louisiana, but in the ABSCAM story, he is linked to a man. Carlos Marcello was constantly fighting Robert Kennedy in terms of trying to stay in the United States as against being deported because he was a mob boss. And after being named as a possible suspect in the Kennedy murder, he still wants his passports to travel. Since 1953, he's been restricted by the federal government on a possible deportation order because of his links to organized crime. Well, in terms of ABSCAM, Marcello has been working with Mario T. Noto, who is the Deputy Commissioner of Immigration, and Marcello promised Noto that when he retired from the federal government and immigration, he could come work for Carlos Marcello, the mob boss. And in return, Noto works for Senator Williams, who has been named in the ABSCAM conflicts in the Labor Department. It is a public relations office in Washington, D.C., called I. Irving Davidson, that's trying to help Marcello travel and get around as a reputable, respectable citizen. And in Washington, D.C., there are links because this Noto, who's been offered a job by Marcello, works on the Senate Labor Committee, of which Senator Williams is chairman, and Williams' wife is part of the professional staff of that committee. If that sounds complicated, I'll say it a little slower, but you do have the tapes to play it over, that Carlos Marcello is linked to the Kennedy assassination, to the attempt to pay off judges in crime cases in Los Angeles, to the Immigration Department, to Washington, D.C. public relations firm, and to Senator Williams, who's now been named in the ABSCAM with his power in the Immigration Committee to offer help to illegal aliens. I told you this would get complicated. We'll do more on the other side and try to clarify some of these points so that I don't go too fast as we expose what's taking place at the present time. Number 428, February the 15th, 1980, and it's Mae Brussell in Carmel, California. I'll be doing many more tapes of Carlos Marcello in the future, but because of my past research into the assassination of John Kennedy, there is this common thread, the name now breaking in the ABSCAM story with Senator Williams and the Senate of the United States and New Jersey influence peddlers back there, and the links of him to the Immigration Department, which is so terribly important. That's the same department that refused to deport the Nazis for the last 30 years and is now making a limit of one more year before they'll, after this year, none will be deported. They'll be home free. This has already been passed. They'll give one more year to deporting. They haven't done anything for 30 years. Well, the Immigration Department's involved here. Carlos Marcello is involved here, and then he also is involved with trial judges, the Bry Lab, the New Orleans, Texas links, and Oklahoma. That will all tie these payoffs, but Marcello's is that common denominator that breaks in the stories now and relates to the past research into the Kennedy murder. Senator Williams is a very important person, a man that has been swept into this scandal. Another important person that we'll be talking a lot about is Representative John Murphy of New York. He was complaining just yesterday that his rights have been violated in the spy scandal, and he's outraged at a story in the Soho Weekly News about him, and his links is the source of the ABSCAM leaks. By breaking them now, they can say we were tried in the press, we didn't have a fair chance, and the Soho Weekly is blaming him for leaking the story at a time that was too early for the story to break in order to go farther. The FBI, Webster's office, and Civiletti, the Attorney General, have said by the story breaking now, we have broken, by leaking the story, we have lost some of the networks of the international national crime syndicate. And they're saying that Representative Murphy of New York was the person who leaked it at this time. Well, there's a wonderful article this week by Morton Mintz in the Washington Post this last week on Representative Murphy. And for my listeners in New York, I have some very wonderful friends there, eager beavers. Please get a hold of the September 24th article in the Village Voice. I need that badly for the research or the continuation. But Morton Mintz talks about the Village Voice article that came out last September, written by Jack Newfield. And the title of the story was The Worst Congressman. It refers to Representative John Murphy of New York City. And at the time that the article came out, Murphy asked the Justice Department to investigate Jack Newfield at the Village Voice, who had listed in the story allegations about Murphy. There are 8 or 10 allegations in this article, which I have to get, about Congressman Murphy. And Murphy had asked the Justice Department to investigate why the Village Voice wrote about him, but it turned out that Murphy himself was under investigation at the time. And the Murphy name comes up in link to the Gambino family. Carlos Marcello is important, but the Gambino investigation is important because that is the link to the Vatican, to a lot of murders taking place, to the Michelle Sindona case, and then the full cycle of Watergate and the use of the CIA and the Vatican and organized crime to work together with narcotic dealers. That's a big ball of wax for those of you who don't have the past tapes, but briefly I'll tell you what the Washington Post had this week about Representative John Murphy, who has been charged of leaking the story. Also, people in New York, if you can get me that Soho Press story about Murphy breaking leaks, that would be great. This article in the Washington Post said that Murphy had been accused by Jack Newfield of being close to the Thomas Gambino, the son of Carlo Gambino, who was killed 3 years ago, that Murphy represented the interests of the Gambino family in organized crime. It also said that he was linked to Anastasio Somoza of Nicaragua. They went to school. 30 years ago, LaSalle Military Academy. That's before Somoza went on to West Point. And Murphy was the advisor to Somoza in Managua when he was kicked out of Nicaragua at the time of the overthrow this last year. Newfield had brought attention, or the New York Times rather, in 1977, that in 1973-74, when there was an Arab oil boycott, Murphy was arranging with Iranian financing and supplies to use Iranian crude oil sent to Nicaragua to General Somoza, and the refinery would be built at Monkey Point off the Atlantic coast, and the oil would be 98% owned by the Somoza family. So Murphy was linked to the Gambinos through various investigations in the Somoza family and oil coming from Iran. Then Jack Newfield pointed out in the Village Voice that Murphy was involved for allegedly taking kickbacks on a construction firm, that the FBI was investigating kickbacks for a construction firm for the Pahlavi Foundation that was building in New York City. The foundation, according to the Washington Post, they describe as an enterprise of the family of the Shah of Iran, and Representative Murphy from New York City was on one of the directors of the Pahlavi Foundation. I said on the last tapes, the last 2 weeks on ABSCAM, that these were going to be very high connections. Now, the FBI was investigating Murphy for links to the Pahlavi Foundation and payoffs. So again, like the Judge Pragerson protection of the judge or bringing in a new judge on that organized crime case in Los Angeles, let's see if the Pahlavi Foundation gets investigated. You see, the Shah of Iran moved out last year. Somoza moved out of Nicaragua last year. Representative Murphy, who's as corrupt as all of them, linked to the Gambino family, moved out. The Vatican is terribly nervous about their links to Michelle Sindona and the Gambino connections, which I've gone into before and may review for you just for a moment on this tape. So just briefly, one of the men caught in this net, the Senator Williams, is involved with Immigration Department, a Mr. Noto, travel for Carlos Marcello. Another member of the investigation is John Murphy, involved with Somoza, the Shah of Iran, the Pahlavi Foundation, and the Gambino family. But the interesting part is the link of Murphy. If he just had a link to the Pahlavi Foundation, it would be one thing, and FBI investigating payoffs to that. Or if he had links to Somoza and sending oil and building refineries for Somoza, a member of our House of Representatives. But the Gambino, which links again to the Vatican and so forth, into international links of the highest level of church and states, and it's the Gambino faction that I said was going to be caught in this web in the Pennsylvania, New Jersey, New York network. It's that group that's being caught in this web. And let's see if the FBI investigations into Murphy, as I say, go into the Pahlavi. But here's one man caught in the ABSCAM who has a finger in the Gambino family in Nicaragua and Somoza, which is the Central Intelligence Agency, and to the Pahlavi Foundation, which was put in by the Central Intelligence Agency, and the Gambino family links to the CIA and the Vatican, so that you have just one person linked to these three elements that has been fingered, and he's crying foul play. Well, naturally, he's crying foul play. He would like himself tried in the news so that when the case comes, it will be dropped and the real story won't come out, or the FBI and people in the Justice Department allowed him to leak this story now before the main network was brought in, and he may be the sacrificial lamb so that the top dogs everywhere from Pahlavi then goes to Chase Manhattan, and that's also brought up in terms of ABSCAM and money sitting in Chase Manhattan. So Congressman Murphy is very important to these connecting links and may be sacrificed, but may be very useful in leaking the story so that it doesn't go high up to the high echelons, and that's, of course, where we would like it to go. And people may react and respond, and as I say, we're going to see a lot of back and forth here. But Representative Murphy, described by Jack Newfield as the worst congressman in September of '79, is now part of the sardines that were pulled in the net of that monstrosity called ABSCAM. When I speak of selective justice or selective investigation, I have to refer to the similarities of this to Watergate, and also I hope I have time on the tape to go into the Watergate operations of the Washington Post and their involvement, I believe, into ABSCAM like they were in Watergate. Richard Nixon and John Mitchell and Maurice Stans and Ehrlichman and Haldeman and all the top team were removed from office, but they never were charged with crimes, murders, 30 primary witnesses within 2 or 3 years of Watergate that were killed, or the Dorothy Hunt plane crash, or the shooting of George Wallace, or the killing of Robert Kennedy. There were endless murders and deaths related to Watergate, and they were just charged with the crime of covering up who went into the Watergate Hotel or what they knew. And really, except for losing certain positions they had, every single one of them is on the borderline of a millionaire today or potential millions, and nothing really happened except they kept the lid on the story. So it's this, it looks like we have a lot of action and a lot of faces changed in Washington, but the corruptness is still there, and this is a continuation of that corruptness and intrigue of, as I say, bagging certain people while they're protecting others. And that is the thing we have to watch as these threads unflow. And I keep repeating this. Some people will get hurt and some will be immune. And the trick is to get those that are immune if they were, in fact, involved in the same crimes. That would be a good trick. Now, on the eve of the ABSCAM story, on tape 425, that was January the 25th, I introduced a book into this series of investigations that I've been doing, asking the question, who is William Taub, and referring to a book called Forces of Power. That's tape number 425. And then on 426, I did more on a book, Forces of Power, and talked about a William Taub who was left for dead in Switzerland, who was involved with the daughters of Trujillo, killed by the CIA. And the daughters are trying to get money from their brothers who live in Spain. He's an attorney for them, as Richard Nixon is for one of the sisters. Taub talks about Henry Kissinger being a Nazi, the role of Randolph Hearst with Nazis, and the Howard Hughes, Las Vegas chicanery, the organized crime teams. And I referred to missing paintings that were paid to Taub as a favor, valuable art treasures, and one of them, Rubens, was missing. And I talked about that on tape 426. And the very thing that opened up the ABSCAM that I mentioned last week was missing paintings, 2 missing oil paintings, stolen art. I referred to it as, on the tape, as I say, last week, and the investigators were looking for oil painting taken 13 years ago, security, stocks, and stolen art. And since that story broke a week ago Sunday, I have made at least 40 long-distance calls around the country. I gave you the name of them, some of them last week, because I felt that Taub's missing painting that I talked about on Friday on that tape could be, may not necessarily be, one of the oil paintings that set off this whole investigation that's breaking, because Taub has the links to every single thing that's in the ABSCAM story. He's got the links to the Gambino, Vatican connections, the organized crime, the Marcello, the CIA, Rosselli and John Rosselli and Carlos Marcelli and the assassination teams, and the chicanery of Nixon, the White House, Henry Kissinger. Taub was left for dead, and it could be that Taub's asking for the investigation of these paintings and so forth could have triggered this off. This could be what I would call Taub's vengeance for almost losing his eyesight, almost losing his life, and the book has the gory details of his recuperation. I don't know what people do when they survive an instance like that, but I have called 30 or 40 people, and I have a list of them in my phone bills I can copy for you to show you how I've tried to find the name of the oil painting. This is the end of the second week, going to the third week, and I can't find it. I called Leslie Maitland of the New York Times, who wrote the story. She's also done stories with Howard Blum, who wrote Wanted Search for the Nazis. I called the New York Times, and I talked to Howard Blum. He knew of my research, and I've talked to him before on a radio show I've called in. He cannot get the name of the oil painting that triggered off as ABSCAM, the missing oil paintings. Taub said he had 2, a Gainsborough and a Rubens, called A Bowl of Fruit. We've called the Justice Department, the FBI. He said if he breaks it in the New York Times, he'll let me know. The local FBI can't work on it, can't find it. The radio stations, talk shows can't find it. Tied up at the bottom or at the center of this story, ABSCAM, has to be possibly those paintings that were taken by Taub. He says 1, although he names 2 paintings. but they came in through a man in the Vatican, and they were given to Cardinal Spellman. I was talking to a man who's worked for the youth organization in Onassis for the past 20 or 30 years, who said Spellman was literally the godfather of New York City. Now, any of you who want to write letters to public officials, make telephone calls, send me copies of your letters, and ask for the name of the painting, because every newspaper article on ABSCAM refers to it beginning with stolen securities, stocks, and stolen art. This is in the Associated Press, United Press, and they keep referring to that, the art. Now, what Taub said was that his paintings were taken when the Teamsters moved his art objects, and he refers to the Teamsters. And involved in this investigation, the Pendorf investigation going from Illinois, is Alan Dorfman and the Teamsters and Senator Howard Cannon of Las Vegas and the Teamsters. So that the Teamsters name is coming up in all these investigations, and the Teamsters were involved in removing his art. Now, the story broke of ABSCAM that the FBI, disguised as Arabs, reclaimed the oil paintings, and that began the investigation of stolen securities and art. And the Vatican is very much involved in missing stolen securities to the tune of about $90 million and $20 million a year minimum being lost in these transactions. But the point is that the art triggered it off. I had mentioned Taub and the art. Taub has connections to every single thread that's breaking now. So I ask again, is this Taub's vengeance? And he refers to the Teamsters moving his art and taking it. And now the threads of the Teamsters to Atlantic City, Nevada, Las Vegas, the gaming, the corruption, the insurance frauds, and so forth, is mushrooming out. Now, if any of you want to follow and write letters, don't call me on the phone. Write letters to Mr. Webster, the Justice Department, your local FBI agent. Telephone them, write their name, the telephone number, and the date, and let's try to make some kind of a portfolio of people who are listening, if you can, or have the courage or energy, and let's get the name of the paintings, because if we know what those are, then we'll know how high the investigation should go, and if they're covering it up, we can say, hey, it goes further. There were very few people to push the investigations of the Koreagate, the Watergate, the Kennedy assassination. If there were more people interested, it wouldn't have stopped at the simplistic level that they stopped. There are very good reporters working on the ABSCAM story. As I say, Howard Blum is working on it, and he wrote the book, Wanted: Search for the Nazis. He's an expert into the Immigration Department and the aspects of criminals in the Immigration Department in terms of Nazi protection. Leslie Maitland works with Howard Blum. I've just talked to her one time and Blum once. She's with the New York Times. And Jeff Girth is writing for the New York Times. Now, there's a whole young generation that doesn't remember the name Jeff Girth. He is a marvelous writer who knows all the tentacles of Mo Dallas, Carlos Marcellos, Richard Nixon, Bibi Rabosa. He wrote a long time ago for Penthouse at the time of Watergate about Mo Dallas and La Costa and the organized crime connections, and they had sued him in Penthouse for around $40 million. I never knew what happened of that suit, if it was dropped or settled or they forgot the whole thing. But the very fact that the Times has Blum and Girth on the ABSCAM story means that these men have a pretty good inkling of where it's going to go. This wasn't just a few 6 Democratic congressmen that got caught, and also Morton Mintz for the Washington Post. I like to see who covers the stories, because there's certain writers for years that cover the main part. Waldron is doing some of the ABSCAM for the New York Times too. But when you know the writer, you know the levels of the cover-up. And Blum and Maitland and Girth are excellent, and Mintz are excellent writers. I get good material when I read their information. So watch articles with a byline of them and study those. They're very important. I have a very important article sent to me by several subscribers that live in New York. It was printed in 1976, titled FBI Agents Got Insecure Loans. This is by Richard Phelan for the New York Times, and it has to do with Security National Bank of New Jersey and unsecured loans for the FBI, that they took loans from $25,000 up to $1 million of loans with no collateral and so forth. Well, this was a time when the FBI was moving into Atlantic City in New Jersey, with mobsters getting ready. In 1977 is when the official casinos began. but there are implications here that the treasurer of an eastern province of the Roman Catholic order was involved with a portfolio that involved $500,000 of a $4 million portfolio and treasury bills and so forth. I'm going into this article later. I don't want to bypass it now, but it involves Vatican funds of Archbishop Paul Marcinkus, and Marcinkus went on to become head of the Vatican Bank. He's the head of it now for Pope John Paul II, and he's a co-worker with Michael Sindona, who's under investigation for his security frauds and manipulations and loss of $45 million at the Franklin Bank in New York. This money was drained out of New Jersey and was washed around in Florida with a Canadian financier in Palm Beach, Florida, and it has to do with the Security National Bank of New Jersey and the Security National Bank of Long Island. So you get the New York, New Jersey, Vatican connections, Newark, New Jersey, that I'm sure could get into the ABSCAM later, or these people are being removed because of possible investigation. This was in 1976 that this article came out of bank loans made to members of the FBI, and they weren't pressed for their payments. They could fall behind of payments. They had outstanding payments, and some weren't being made at all. FBI agents in New Jersey linked to Long Island and the Vatican. I'll do a good part of that tape very soon, but I want you to know that these are the threads that are available. We can't, as I say, put it all on any single taper probably in a lifetime. Also, that trial that's going on in New York City with Mr. Scotto, that links into this ABSCAM that you'll see, Anthony M. Scotto with Governor Kerry and Mayor Beam and Jimmy Carter campaigning in '76. And the Scotto thing goes into Meade Esposito. I've done a tape on Esposito and the Democratic Party, and it has to do with the Gambino family. And New York Times says in August '69, after an investigation in the United States Senate Subcommittee on Organized Crime, Mr. Scotto was identified by the Justice Department as a captain in the crime family of the late Carlo Gambino. And, of course, the Vatican connections of Sindona to Gambino are there, and the connections of Representative Murphy of New York are there. I hope that this tape isn't too jumbled in the names that I'm throwing out, and it's terribly important to set the ground rules for these investigations because, like Watergate that went on for 7 years, this is going to mushroom and incorporate so many areas, and the Vatican totally owned Watergate Hotel, and Mr. Sindona had offered $1 million to Maurice Stans and Richard Nixon's re-election. These things never came out at the time of Watergate, but there's this whole layer of Vatican mob, Italian mob, Jewish mob, and the FBI taking over the turf, Intertel, Irish Catholics, I believe, moving the mobsters out, that what you call Watergating is cleaning out one area to make it safe for the other, that it's a political drug war going on simultaneously, and who's ever president of the United States has a big decision in the matter. Jimmy Carter, for example, named the U.S. attorney in New Jersey, who decides cases that are prosecuted or not. U.S. Attorney Robert Del Tufo of New Jersey was named by Jimmy Carter. Carter has, as I've mentioned many times, these convoluted drug connections in his past and present, currently. Well, it was Del Tufo who said when Congressman Williams, Senator Williams, was being investigated, and Williams is from New Jersey, with long seniority and power, it was Del Tufo who said, don't prosecute him, there's nothing there, drop the case. Carter appoints Del Tufo, and Del Tufo wants to whitewash. Well, it turned out that the FBI photographed and tape recorded Senator Williams in New York City and in Washington, D.C., so it's a little hard when you're stuffing your pockets with money or giving it to your bag man to whitewash it, but Jimmy Carter appoints a U.S. attorney, and the U.S. attorney, if he had had his way, would have protected Williams. Now, when Senator Williams is caught, he may give out more. But the important thing is that the stories I've done on Esposito link to Anthony Scotto. They link to the White House, to the presidents. This current president of the United States photographed with him. And one more link of Jimmy Carter to the Gambino family in '69. This man was recognized as being part of the family of Gambino, and there's Jimmy Carter with the governor and mayor of New York City and Anthony Scudo all photographed together. Now, the Justice Department and the FBI have been investigating ABSCAM for 2 years. So it's very interesting that Carter is photographed with members of the Gambino family, and as I say, Rosalind Carter with Gacy in Chicago, the mass killer who also is linked to the Polish church connections there, the Jim Jones connections, the drug running narcotics in San Francisco, photographed and in the White House with Mr. Ellsworth, federal agencies and involved with drugs and various crime syndicates as well as the federal agencies. And Polito, Jimmy and James Polito photographed with one of them before they're both killed. The Carters are very identifiable with gun running, narcotics, organized crime. Why wasn't Jimmy Carter in 1979 told not to be photographed with Anthony M. Scotto? New York Times, December 17, 1979, has a picture of Jimmy Carter with him, and down below they have him described as a member of the Gambino family, and Carter, of course, was entertaining the Pope generously, and the Pope has these links to the Gambino organized crime family through Michel Sindona and the Vatican Bank. This is a watergating of Carter and this drug group by the FBI. See, they could have warned him not to be photographed with these people. They're linked to organized crime. You know, the story made the big headlines that John Connally got $1,000 from Mo Dalitz of La Costa. Mo Dalitz was part of the assassination teams when Connally was governor of Texas. And all of a sudden, Connally says, "Oh, take your $1,000 back. I didn't know Mo Dalitz was from crime, or I didn't know." And Connally acts like, "I can't be tainted in my $5 million campaign fund or $8 million campaign for president of the United States. Take away that $1,000 of Mo Dalitz." And that makes all the headlines. And the same week that that's happening, Jimmy Carter is in the New York Times with a description of the person he's photographed as being part of the crime family. Again, it's this separate, distinct pushing out of certain people, because Carter could have been warned over and over by the Secret Service and the FBI and the Justice Department that he and his wife are constantly in the company of gun runners and narcotic dealers. Now, when I say Carter's a patsy, that doesn't mean I feel sorry for him. I hate the bastard. I think he is a treacherous man, and nothing could be better than to remove him out of office with Mr. Brzezinski as the head of his Security Council. But it may be that if Ronald Reagan is president and takes General Haig, who then becomes president, or John Connally becomes president, or Mr. Bush of the CIA, who played a large part in China as the ambassador, getting ready to arm China against Russia, it doesn't mean we won't get Brzezinski back again with Henry Kissinger and the two of them waltzing in the White House. It could be that there'll be pressure to remove Carter and Watergate him like Nixon in the next few months, and then put in the other team with tentacles just as bad or worse. It's just the fact that Carter is being identified with all of these elements, and it's very subtle. And now with ABSCAM and with the Shah of Iran and Somoza and Gambinos, all of this coming together, it could escalate, and of course Carter could be Watergated like Nixon, and then the next team comes over. The next team may be worse, but it's the shuffling of the people and their links to these scandals at this time, just months before the election, and predominantly Democrats. It's terribly important. 60 Republicans got together last week and scolded the Democrats for not cleaning out their house, and yet Watergate and Koreagate were cover-ups of the entire Republican network. So they're trying to pull in potential governors. Williams was going to run for governor of New Jersey, and he's been pulled out, but will then a Republican governor take over New Jersey and have Atlantic City mobsters under his control because Williams has been Watergated. You see, this is a sweep of corrupt Democrats, whereas the corrupt Republicans got off easy last time, and it's election year again, and there's going to be a lot of feet shuffling in 50 states. Like the FBI says, they have investigations going in 50 states. November the 9th, 1979, on the tape I talked about the links of Michael Sindona to Carlo Gambino and Salvatrice Gambino and the organized crime family. And Sindona was the head banker for the Vatican, came to the United States with their funds to invest in the United States. Also important is that when this story broke of the ABSCAM, 3 days later, it broke February the 3rd, financier Sindona, who's on trial and who's been out on $3 million bail because he was a multimillionaire with a lot of banking behind him. 3 days after this story broke, Sindona was put into the New York jail for the first time. He slept his first night in jail. The federal prosecutor had just begun the case of misconduct, corruption, and criminal use of power. Sindona was swept off the streets and put into jail just when ABSCAM broke. I wish I had more time. It's so frustrating, but it's Mae Brussell in Carmel, California. Next week we will continue with ABSCAM, Brilev, and Pendorf. Take care of yourselves and save your articles. Send me what you can, and we'll try to put some more pieces together for you.